In the darkest corners of our world, where shadows dance with secrets and moonlight reveals truths we dare not speak, there exists a love story that will shatter everything you believe about power, betrayal, and the ultimate price of immortality. What happens when the most feared creature of the night meets the one woman who holds the key to his destruction? What happens when centuries of calculated cruelty collide with a heart that refuses to break? This is not just another tale of vampires and mortals. This is the story of a king who thought he controlled everything, and the dying woman who taught him that some victories come with a price too steep to pay. Prepare yourself for a journey into a world where love becomes the deadliest weapon, where the hunter becomes the hunted, and where the greatest act of devotion might just be the ultimate act of revenge. Some stories begin with once upon a time. This one begins with the end. The grand ballroom of the Blackthorn estate sparkled under crystal chandeliers, but the light seemed to bend away from the figure standing at the center of it all. Damien Blackthorn, the vampire king, moved through his guests with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known defeat. His dark hair caught the light like polished obsidian, and his pale skin seemed to glow with an otherworldly perfection that drew every eye in the room. Tonight was special. Tonight, he would choose his newest conquest from among the carefully selected mortal women who had been invited to his estate. Each one had been chosen for her beauty, her wit, or her social standing. Each one believed she might be the lucky woman to capture the heart of the mysterious billionaire who had taken the city by storm over the past year. They had no idea what he really was. Damien smiled as he watched them flutter around him like moths to a flame. There was Margaret, the senator's daughter, with her perfect blonde curls and diamond necklace that cost more than most people's homes. She kept finding reasons to brush against his arm, her laugh a bit too loud, her smile a bit too bright. Then there was Victoria, the famous actress whose movies had made her a household name. She stood by the piano, her red dress hugging every curve, her green eyes following his every movement with predatory interest. But it was the woman in the corner who caught his attention. She sat alone on a velvet sofa, seemingly unbothered by the social spectacle around her. Her dress was simple compared to the others, a deep blue that matched her eyes, and her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders. She wasn't trying to catch his eye or position herself in his path. Instead, she held a glass of champagne that she barely touched while watching the party with an expression that seemed almost amused. Damien found himself drawn to her in a way that surprised him. In his 3 centuries of existence, he had learned to read people like open books, the desperate ones, the ambitious ones, the ones who would do anything for a taste of power or wealth. But this woman was different. There was something in her eyes, something that suggested she saw through all the glamour and games to something deeper. He glided across the room toward her, his supernatural hearing picking up the whispers that followed in his wake. The other women watched with barely concealed jealousy as he approached their mysterious competition. They wondered who she was, how she had gotten an invitation, what made her so special that she could afford to ignore the most eligible bachelor in the city. "You don't seem to be enjoying yourself," Damien said, as he settled into the chair across from her. Up close, he could see that her skin had a slight pallor to it, though not the marble perfection of his own kind. There were faint shadows under her eyes, as if she hadn't been sleeping well. She looked up at him with those striking blue eyes, and for a moment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Uncertainty. Her gaze didn't falter or flutter like the others. Instead, she studied him with the same quiet intensity she had been directing at the party. "I'm enjoying it more than you might think," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "It's fascinating to watch people when they think no one is paying attention." "And what do you see?" A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Hunters and prey, mostly. Though sometimes it's hard to tell which is which." Damien leaned back in his chair, intrigued. Most mortals couldn't see past his carefully constructed facade of wealth and charm. They certainly didn't speak to him with such casual insight. "And which am I?" "That remains to be seen," she said, finally taking a sip of her champagne. "Though I suspect you're used to being both." Before Damien could respond, Margaret appeared at his elbow, her perfect smile firmly in place. "Mr. Blackthorn, I was hoping you might give me a tour of your beautiful home. I'm particularly interested in art, and I heard you have an impressive collection." Damien didn't take his eyes off the woman on the sofa as he replied, "Perhaps later, Miss Peterson." "I'm quite content where I am." Margaret's smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "Of course. I don't believe I've met your friend." The way she said friend made it clear she didn't consider the other woman any real competition. Eleanor Hayes, the woman said simply, extending her hand to Margaret with polite formality. Hayes? Margaret's eyes lit up with recognition. Are you related to Jonathan Hayes, the philanthropist? He was my father, Eleanor replied, and something in her tone suggested the past tense was significant. Margaret's expression shifted, becoming almost predatory. Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. The cancer, wasn't it? Such a tragedy. Though I suppose you inherited his foundation. Damien watched Eleanor's face carefully, noting the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Among other things, she said quietly. Well, philanthropy is such important work, Margaret continued, clearly fishing for information about Eleanor's wealth and connections. Though I imagine it must be quite overwhelming for someone so young to take on such responsibilities alone. I'm managing, Eleanor said, her tone growing cooler. Sensing the tension, Damien stood and offered Eleanor his hand. Would you care to see the gardens? The roses are particularly beautiful in the moonlight. Eleanor looked up at him, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. Her skin was warm against his cold flesh, and he noticed the way she didn't pull away from the contact. As they walked through the French doors onto the terrace, Damien could hear Margaret's frustrated whisper to one of her friends. Who does she think she is? She's nobody special, just another charity case living off her father's money. If Eleanor heard the comment, she gave no sign. Instead, she moved to the stone railing and looked out over the estate's sprawling grounds. The moonlight caught in her hair and painted her skin silver, making her look ethereal and fragile. Beautiful night, she said softly. Damien moved to stand beside her, close enough that he could hear her heartbeat. Steady, but perhaps a bit faster than normal. You handled that well back there. Margaret isn't used to being ignored. Eleanor turned to look at him, and in the moonlight he could see something in her expression that made him pause. There was sadness there, but also a kind of fierce determination that spoke of someone who had faced difficult truths and come to terms with them. I don't have time for games, she said simply. Life is too short to waste it on people who see you as nothing more than a stepping stone or a threat. And yet you came to my party. Surely you knew it would be full of exactly those kinds of people. Eleanor smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I came because I was curious about you, Mr. Blackthorne. You've created quite a stir in the city with your sudden appearance and mysterious background. People love to speculate about where you came from and how you made your fortune so quickly. And what do you speculate? I think you're someone who has learned to wear masks very well. But I also think there's something real underneath all the performance. Damien felt that unfamiliar sensation again, the feeling of being seen in a way that made him uncomfortably exposed.
He was used to being desired, feared, or envied.
He wasn't used to being understood. What makes you think that? He asked. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains that bordered his estate. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I recognized the look in your eyes. It's the same one I see in the mirror every morning. The look of someone who knows that time is running out. Damien turned to study her profile, taking in details he had missed before. The slight hollowness in her cheeks, the way she held herself as if conserving energy, the careful way she had been nursing that single glass of champagne all evening. Eleanor, he said carefully, are you ill? She met his gaze directly, and in her eyes he saw the answer before she spoke. Terminal brain cancer. 6 months, maybe less if I'm unlucky. 8 if I'm very lucky and respond well to treatment. The words hit him like a physical blow. In all his centuries of existence, surrounded by death and darkness, he had somehow not expected this. Not from her. Not when she had just begun to interest him in ways no mortal had in decades. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it more than he had meant those words in a very long time. Don't be, she replied with a slight smile. It's clarifying, actually. Knowing your time is limited makes everything else seem less important. The games people play, the things they worry about, the masks they wear, none of it matters. When you know you won't be here to see how it all turns out. They stood in silence for a while, the sounds of the party drifting out from behind them. Damien found himself studying Eleanor's face in the moonlight, memorizing details he might not have noticed otherwise. The way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the gentle curve of her lips, the quiet strength in the set of her shoulders. Is that why you're here tonight? He asked finally. Because none of it matters? Partly, she admitted. But also because I wanted to meet the man who has everyone so fascinated. I wanted to see if the mystery was worth the speculation. And? Eleanor turned to face him fully, and when she spoke, there was something in her voice that made his ancient heart skip in his chest. I think you're far more interesting than any of them could possibly imagine. From inside the house, the sound of laughter and music continued, but out here in the moonlit garden, it felt as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Damien found himself wanting to tell her everything, to strip away all his carefully constructed lies, and show her exactly what kind of monster she was talking to. Instead, he said, "Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? Somewhere quiet, away from all this." Eleanor considered the invitation for a long moment, her blue eyes searching his face as if looking for something specific. Finally, she nodded. "I'd like that very much." As they made their way back into the house, Damien caught sight of Margaret and several other women watching them with undisguised curiosity and jealousy. He realized that he no longer cared what any of them thought or wanted. For the first time in 3 centuries, his attention was completely focused on one person. A person who was dying. The irony wasn't lost on him. He, who had an eternity stretching before him, had finally found someone who made him want to stop time. But Eleanor Hayes, with her quiet strength and piercing insight, had perhaps 8 months left to live. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Damien found himself making polite conversation, while his mind remained fixed on the woman who had just turned his world upside down. When Eleanor said goodbye, she shook his hand with the same formal politeness she had shown Margaret, but her fingers lingered against his for just a moment longer than necessary. After the last guest had departed and the servants had finished cleaning up, Damien stood alone in his study, staring out the window at the gardens where he and Eleanor had talked. For the first time in decades, he felt something that might have been loneliness. But more than that, he felt something that terrified him in its unfamiliarity. He felt hope. Hope that Eleanor Hayes might be different from all the others. Hope that she might be able to see past the monster to something worth caring about. Hope that maybe, just maybe, her remaining time on Earth might be enough to show him what it felt like to be truly alive again. But as he stood there in the darkness, another thought crept into his mind. Cold and calculating as the predator he had always been, Eleanor Hayes was dying, which meant she had nothing left to lose. That could make her either the most dangerous woman he had ever encountered or the most valuable. Time would tell which it would be. Outside, the moon continued its ancient dance across the sky, casting long shadows across the estate grounds. And somewhere in the city below, Eleanor Hayes was preparing for bed, her mind full of thoughts about the mysterious man who had looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person in the room. Neither of them slept well that night, each consumed with thoughts of the other and the strange connection that had sparked between them in the moonlit garden. Neither of them could have guessed that their meeting would set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. The hunt had begun, though neither hunter nor prey was quite what they seemed. The restaurant Damien chose was everything Eleanor had expected it would be: exclusive, expensive, and intimate. La Bernardine sat perched on the top floor of the Meridian Tower, offering a view of the entire city through floor-to-ceiling windows. The tables were spaced far enough apart to ensure privacy, and the lighting was dim enough to create an atmosphere of romance and mystery. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, wearing a simple black dress that somehow made her look more elegant than all the designer gowns at the previous night's party. Damien watched her approach through the restaurant, noting the way other diners' heads turned to follow her progress. She had a natural grace that couldn't be bought or taught, the kind of poise that came from accepting who you were completely. "You look beautiful," he said as he stood to pull out her chair. "Thank you," she replied, settling into her seat with a slight smile. "This is quite a view. Do you come here often?" "Often enough that they keep my usual table available," Damien admitted. "I hope you don't mind the height. Some people find it unsettling." Eleanor looked out at the city sprawling below them, lights twinkling like earthbound stars. "I love it, actually. There's something peaceful about seeing everything from up here. It puts things in perspective." Their waiter appeared immediately, as if he had been waiting for some invisible signal from Damien. After they had ordered drinks and an appetizer to share, Eleanor folded her hands on the table and looked at him directly. "So," she said, "are you going to tell me who you really are, or should I keep guessing?"
Damien nearly choked on his wine.
In 3 centuries, no mortal had ever been quite so direct with him. "What makes you think I'm not exactly who I appear to be?" "Several things," Eleanor said, counting off on her fingers. "First, you appeared in the city about a year ago with no traceable history before that. Trust me, I checked. Second, you somehow acquired not just wealth but the kind of old money connections that usually take generations to develop. Third, you have the most extensive art collection I've ever seen, including pieces that should be in museums, and you seem to know intimate details about all of them. She paused to take a sip of her wine before continuing. But mostly, it's the way you carry yourself. You move like someone who has never been afraid of anything, ever. That kind of confidence doesn't come from money or success. It comes from power. Real power. The kind that most people never even imagine. Damien set down his glass carefully, his mind racing. Eleanor's observations were dangerously accurate, and her willingness to voice them suggested either remarkable courage or complete recklessness. Possibly both. "You've been investigating me," he said. "I've been curious about you," she corrected. There's a difference. When you're facing a terminal diagnosis, you develop a talent for cutting through pretense quickly. I don't have time to waste on surface-level interactions. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying his face in the candlelight. "I think you're much older than you look. I think you've lived through things that would break most people, and I think you're lonely in a way that most people couldn't even comprehend." Each word hit him like a physical blow. Damien had spent decades perfecting his human facade, learning to blend in seamlessly with mortal society. Yet this dying woman had seen through it all in a matter of hours. "What if you're right?" he asked carefully. "What if I'm all those things? Would that frighten you? Should it?" Most people would say yes. Eleanor considered this, turning her wineglass between her fingers. Most people are afraid of things they don't understand, but when you're facing death, fear becomes a luxury you can't afford. "What's the worst thing you could do to me, Damien? Kill me?" She smiled at the irony. "I'm already dying." Before Damien could respond, their appetizer arrived. The waiter placed the dish between them with flourish, describing each ingredient in detail. Both of them nodded politely, but neither was really listening. The tension between them had shifted, becoming something deeper and more dangerous than simple attraction. "You're right about some things," Damien said once they were alone again. "I am older than I look, much older, and I have lived through things that would break most people. But you're wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "You should be afraid of me." Instead of recoiling, Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her blue eyes intense in the candlelight. "Why?" Damien found himself caught between the urge to flee and the desire to tell her everything. She was asking questions no mortal should ask, but her fearlessness was intoxicating in a way he hadn't expected. "'Cause I'm not human," he said quietly, watching her face for any sign of fear or disbelief. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze never wavering from his face. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and thoughtful. "I know." The simple acknowledgement stunned him more than screaming or fainting would have. "You know, I suspected. Your skin is too perfect, too pale. You never seem to eat much when others are watching. Your eyes change color slightly in different light. And there's something about the way you move. Like gravity doesn't quite affect you the same way it affects everyone else." She paused to take another sip of wine, as if they were discussing the weather rather than his supernatural nature. "Plus, I've been doing some research into the history of that art collection. Several of those pieces were owned by families that disappeared under mysterious circumstances, always at night, always with no witnesses, and always with rumors of a mysterious stranger who had been seen with them shortly before." Damien stared at her, his ancient mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "And you came to dinner with me anyway?"
Yes. Why? Eleanor set down her wineglass and met his gaze directly.
"Because I'm curious about what it would be like to be truly known by someone. And because I think you might be curious about the same thing." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of her words settling between them. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of fine dining and polite conversation, but their table felt like an island removed from the rest of the world. "What do you want from me, Eleanor?" Damien asked finally. "Honesty," she replied without hesitation. "I want to know who you really are, not the character you play for everyone else. I want to understand what it's like to live for centuries, to watch the world change around you while you remain the same. I want to know what you've loved and lost, what you regret, what still has the power to surprise you." She paused, her expression growing softer. "And I want you to know me the same way. Not as the tragic dying woman, or the wealthy philanthropist, or any other role I'm expected to play. Just as Eleanor, whoever that is when all the pretense is stripped away." Damien felt something inside his chest that he had thought was dead for decades. It took him a moment to recognize it as hope, but a different kind than he had felt the night before. This wasn't hope for something he might gain or possess. This was hope for something he might become. "It's dangerous," he said quietly. "Knowing me, I mean. I've hurt people, Eleanor. More people than you could imagine, and in ways that would horrify you. Have you hurt anyone who didn't deserve it?" The question caught him off guard. "That's a complicated question. Is it? Have you ever hurt someone innocent? Someone who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time?" Damien thought back over 3 centuries of existence, sorting through memories of blood and violence. To his surprise, he realized that while he had killed many people, they had all been predators in their own right. Corrupt politicians, violent criminals, people who used their power to harm others. He had never fed on anyone truly innocent. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I have. Then maybe you're not the monster you think you are." Their main courses arrived, interrupting the conversation. As they ate, Eleanor asked him about his art collection, and Damien found himself telling her stories he had never shared with anyone. About watching Da Vinci work on a portrait in his studio, about the night he had acquired a Monet directly from the artist himself, about the small sketch by Picasso that held memories of a brief but intense friendship in 1920s Paris. "You knew them," Eleanor said wonderingly. "All these famous artists, you actually knew them personally?" "Some of them," Damien confirmed. "Though friendship was always complicated. I had to be careful not to let anyone get too close, not to let them see what I really was. That must have been incredibly lonely. It was the price of survival. Humans in general don't react well to discovering that vampires exist. History is full of witch hunts and purges, and while they rarely succeeded in finding the real monsters, they usually managed to kill plenty of innocent people in the process." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "So you learned to hide in plain sight. To be rich enough and powerful enough that people wouldn't ask too many questions." "Exactly. Money and influence are the best camouflage in the modern world. No one investigates someone who can make their problems disappear or their careers advance. But it hasn't made you happy." It wasn't a question, and Damien didn't try to deny it. Happiness wasn't the goal. Survival was. "And now?" "Now I'm not sure what the goal is anymore." Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "Maybe that's progress." As the evening continued, Damien found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in decades. He told Eleanor about the loneliness of watching everyone he had ever cared about grow old and die while he remained unchanged. He spoke about the weight of carrying centuries of memories, both beautiful and terrible. He described the constant vigilance required to maintain his human facade, and the exhaustion that came with never being able to truly relax his guard. In return, Eleanor shared her own stories. She told him about her childhood with a father who had taught her that wealth was meaningless unless it was used to help others. She spoke about her work with the foundation, the projects they funded, the lives they had touched. She described the moment she had received her diagnosis, and the strange sense of relief that had come with finally knowing exactly how much time she had left. "Most people live their entire lives not knowing when they're going to die," she said. "There's a kind of freedom in knowing. It makes every moment more precious. But it also makes it easier to let go of things that don't really matter." "Like what?" "Like trying to impress people who don't really care about you. Like worrying about what people will think if you speak your mind. Like being afraid to take risks or say what you really feel." She looked at him across the table, her blue eyes bright with something that might have been mischief. "Like being afraid to have dinner with a vampire." Damien laughed, surprising himself with the sound. When had he last laughed at something genuinely funny rather than out of politeness or manipulation? "You're remarkable," he said, meaning it completely. "I'm dying," Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. "It tends to make people either remarkable or bitter. I decided to try for remarkable." By the time they finished dessert, the restaurant was nearly empty. They had been talking for over 3 hours, but it felt like minutes to Damien. As he walked Eleanor to her car, he found himself reluctant to end the evening. "Would you like to see my real art collection?" he asked impulsively. "Not the pieces I display for guests, but the ones I keep private?" Eleanor paused with her hand on her car door, studying his expression. "Yes," she said finally. "I would." They drove to his estate in separate cars, Eleanor following Damien's sleek black Mercedes through the winding roads that led to his property. As they pulled up to the main house, Damien felt a flutter of something that might have been nervousness. He was about to show her things he had never shared with any mortal. Things that would reveal depths of himself he had kept hidden for centuries. Inside the house, Damien led Eleanor past the grand staircase and down a hallway she hadn't seen during the party. At the end of the corridor, he stopped before what appeared to be a blank wall, and pressed his hand against a concealed panel. The walls slid away, revealing a hidden room beyond. "My private gallery," he said, gesturing for her to enter. Eleanor stepped into the room and gasped. The space was larger than most people's homes, with perfectly controlled lighting illuminating dozens of masterpieces. But these weren't just any artworks. These were pieces that the art world believed had been lost or destroyed. Paintings that existed only in art history textbooks. Sculptures that museums around the world would kill to possess. "Damien," she breathed, moving slowly through the room. "Some of these are supposed to be lost forever." "Officially, they are," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "I've spent centuries collecting them, saving them from wars and disasters and human stupidity. This room represents over 1,000 years of human creativity and genius." Eleanor stopped before a painting that made her heart skip. "Is that a Van Gogh? One I've never seen before?" "He gave it to me the week before he died. Said he wanted someone to have it who would understand what he was trying to capture." Damien moved to stand beside her, looking up at the swirling colors and passionate brushstrokes. "He was lonely too, you know. Different from me, but lonely in his own way." They moved through the gallery together, and with each piece, Damien shared another story, another memory from his long existence. Eleanor listened with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every word, every detail. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked eventually. "Because I want you to know who I really am," Damien said simply. "All of it. The beautiful and the terrible, the lonely and the magnificent. I want you to see what 3 centuries of existence looks like when you strip away all the pretense." Eleanor turned to face him, and in the gallery's soft lighting, she looked almost ethereal. "And what do you see when you look at me? Someone who isn't afraid to be exactly who she is. Someone who has found a way to be brave even when facing the ultimate unknown. Someone who makes me remember what it felt like to be human." They stood close together in the middle of the hidden gallery, surrounded by centuries of artistic achievement and human brilliance. The air between them seemed charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked quietly. "I don't know," Damien admitted. "I've never been in this situation before." "Neither have I." They both knew that whatever was happening between them was unprecedented for both of them. He had never met a mortal who could see through his facade so clearly, and she had never faced her remaining time with someone who could offer her forever if she wanted it. The choice that hung in the air between them was unspoken but understood. Damien could offer her immortality, centuries of existence like his own. But that would mean becoming what he was, leaving behind her humanity completely. For the first time in his long existence, Damien found himself hoping that someone would choose to stay mortal rather than accept his dark gift, because what he was beginning to feel for Eleanor Hayes was too precious to risk destroying with the transformation that might change everything about who she was. As they stood surrounded by the accumulated beauty of centuries, both of them realized that they were facing the most important decision of their lives, and for perhaps the first time ever, neither of them was sure what the right choice would be. The weeks that followed their first dinner together fell into a pattern that surprised both of them with its domesticity. Despite Damien's supernatural nature and Eleanor's terminal diagnosis, they found themselves settling into something that looked remarkably like a normal relationship. They had dinner together most evenings, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes at his estate, occasionally at her smaller but elegantly appointed townhouse. Eleanor continued her work with the Hayes Foundation, though Damien noticed that she tired more easily now than she had even a month before. She tried to hide it, maintaining her usual poise and determination, but he could hear the subtle changes in her heartbeat, could smell the faint chemical scent that her medications left on her skin. For his part, Damien found himself making changes to his routine that he would have considered impossible just a few weeks earlier. He cancelled meetings to spend time with Eleanor. He turned down social invitations that would have been politically or financially advantageous. Most surprisingly of all, he found himself feeding less frequently, as if his usual predatory hunger was being satisfied in other ways. They talked about everything except the 2 subjects that hung between them like unspoken promises. Eleanor never asked him to turn her into a vampire, and Damien never offered. Both of them seemed to understand that once that conversation began, everything else would change. Instead, they explored the city together like tourists, despite both having lived there for years. Eleanor showed Damien places he had never noticed, small cafes and bookshops and art galleries that existed below the radar of high society. In return, he took her to private clubs and exclusive events where his influence opened doors that remained closed to almost everyone else. You're different when you're with her, Marcus observed one evening as Damien prepared to leave his office early again. Marcus had been Damien's lieutenant for over a century, one of the few vampires he trusted completely. More human, somehow. Damien paused in adjusting his tie, meeting Marcus's eyes in the reflection of his office window. Is that a problem? I'm not sure yet, Marcus replied honestly. The others have noticed. There are whispers about whether the great Damien Blackthorn is going soft for a mortal woman. Let them whisper, Damien said, but he could hear the edge in his own voice. He had been so focused on Eleanor that he had perhaps neglected the delicate politics that kept his position as vampire king secure. What happens when she dies? Marcus asked bluntly. Because she will die, Damien. Whether it's in 6 months or 60 years, mortals always die. And when they do, they leave us alone again. Damien turned away from the window to face his old friend. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you remember who and what you are before you lose yourself completely in playing house with a human. That evening, Damien arrived at Eleanor's townhouse feeling unsettled in ways he couldn't quite name. She opened the door herself as usual, dismissing the housekeeper, who would have answered for her. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, and despite the conversation with Marcus, Damien felt his chest tighten at the sight of her. You're late, she said, though her tone was teasing rather than accusatory. I was starting to think you'd decided to stand me up for a more exciting evening. Never, he said, following her into the warmth of her living room. The space was so different from his own estate, filled with comfortable furniture and personal photographs rather than priceless artifacts. It felt like a home rather than a museum. Eleanor had prepared dinner herself, something she had been doing more often lately. Damien suspected it was because cooking gave her a sense of purpose and normalcy that her illness was gradually stealing from her. He played along, complimenting the meal and eating enough to seem convincingly human, though he could derive no real nourishment from mortal food. How was your day? She asked as they settled onto her sofa with wine afterward. Complicated, Damien admitted. Marcus thinks I'm losing perspective. About what? About you. About us. About what I am and what my responsibilities are. Eleanor curled up against his side, her warmth seeping through his shirt. And what do you think? I think I don't care what Marcus or anyone else thinks anymore. I think for the first time in 3 centuries, I'm exactly where I want to be. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but serious. Damien, what happens to your people when their king disappears? The question surprised him. What do you mean? I mean, you're not just a vampire. You're their leader. You have responsibilities to them, don't you? People who depend on you? Damien felt a familiar twist of guilt in his stomach. It was exactly what Marcus had been trying to tell him, but hearing it from Eleanor made it impossible to dismiss. Yes, he said quietly. I do. Then you can't just abandon all of that for me. I won't let you. He pulled back to look at her face, seeing the determination there that he had grown to love and fear in equal measure.
What are you saying? I'm saying that I care about you too much to let you destroy everything you've built for my sake.
I have 6 months left, maybe less. You have eternity. You can't sacrifice eternity for 6 months. What if I don't want eternity without you? The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that made them both flinch. It was as close as either of them had come to acknowledging the impossible choice that loomed over their relationship. Eleanor reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his marble skin. Then we need to talk about the alternative. Damien went very still. Eleanor, no. Listen to me. We both know what you could offer me. We both know it's possible. But we also both know that it would change everything about who I am. And we don't know if I would still be me afterward. She was right, and they both knew it. The transformation from human to vampire was traumatic under the best of circumstances. Some retained their essential personality and memories intact. Others lost pieces of themselves that could never be recovered. There was no way to predict which type of transition Eleanor might experience. I won't pressure you, Damien said carefully. The choice has to be entirely yours. I know. But I also know that if I'm going to make that choice, I need to understand exactly what it means. Not just the romance and the immortality, but the reality of what your existence is actually like. Damien felt a chill that had nothing to do with his supernatural nature. What are you asking? I want to see all of it. Not just the beautiful parts or the lonely parts, but the dark parts too. I want to understand what you do to survive, how you maintain your position, what you've had to become in order to live for 3 centuries. Eleanor, some things can't be unseen. I'm going to die anyway, she said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that never failed to surprise him. What's the worst that could happen? That I'll be horrified and decide I don't want to become a vampire? That might be for the best. The next evening, Damien took Eleanor to a part of the city she had never seen before. Underground, beneath the gleaming surface of downtown, there was another world entirely. A world of shadows and secrets where vampires, demons, and other supernatural beings gathered away from mortal eyes. The club was called Sanctuary, and it had existed in various forms for over 200 years. To human authorities, it appeared to be nothing more than an abandoned subway station. To supernatural creatures, it was neutral ground where old enemies could meet without fear of violence. Eleanor stayed close to Damien as they descended into the depths of the club, her eyes wide as she took in the otherworldly sights around them. Vampires with eyes that glowed like coals danced with creatures that might have been angels or demons or something else entirely. The music was hypnotic and alien, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This is where I come when I need to remember what I am," Damien said, his voice barely audible over the supernatural symphony around them. They found a table in an alcove where they could observe without being too conspicuous. Almost immediately, other vampires began approaching their table. Some came to pay their respects to Damien, others to satisfy their curiosity about the mortal woman he had brought into their world. Eleanor handled each encounter with the same poise she had shown at his mortal society parties. But Damien could sense her growing tension as the evening wore on. These creatures didn't bother to hide their predatory nature the way he did. They looked at her with open hunger, speculation about what her blood might taste like, wondering why their king was wasting time with a mortal who would be dead in a matter of months anyway. "She smells sick," one particularly crude vampire remarked to his companion, apparently not caring that both Damien and Eleanor could hear him clearly. Why would anyone want damaged goods? Damien was on his feet before the words had fully left the vampire's mouth, his hand closing around the creature's throat with deadly precision. The music stopped as if someone had thrown a switch, and every eye in the club turned toward their table. "Did you just insult my guest?" Damien asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had made him king of his kind. The vampire's eyes went wide with fear as he realized his mistake. "No, my lord. I meant no disrespect." "Then perhaps you should learn to keep your opinions to yourself," Damien said, releasing the creature with just enough force to send him stumbling backward into another table. The music resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. Every vampire in the club now understood that Eleanor Hayes was under the king's protection, and anyone who wished to remain in his good graces would treat her with respect. "You didn't need to do that," Eleanor said quietly as Damien sat back down. "Yes, I did. This world has rules, and one of them is that insults to me or mine are answered immediately and decisively." Eleanor studied his face in the club's dim lighting, noting the way his features had taken on a harder edge, the way his eyes had gone cold and calculating. "This is what Marcus was talking about, isn't it? The responsibilities you have that I can't understand." "Part of them," Damien admitted. "Being king means being willing to use violence to maintain order. It means making decisions that affect hundreds of other creatures. It means never being able to show weakness or uncertainty, because the moment I do, someone will try to take my place. And if they succeed, then a lot of people die, both human and vampire. I may not be the kindest leader my people have ever had, but I am the most stable. The vampires who would challenge me tend to be either young and reckless or old and bitter. Neither type makes for good leadership." Eleanor absorbed this information silently, her gaze moving around the club to take in the various supernatural creatures who populated Damien's world. When she looked back at him, her expression was thoughtful but not afraid. "Show me more," she said. Over the following weeks, Damien gradually introduced Eleanor to the full reality of his existence. He took her to vampire courts where disputes were settled with violence and ancient law. He showed her the feeding grounds where his kind hunted among the human population, always careful to target only those who deserved their fate. He let her witness the delicate negotiations between different supernatural factions that kept the peace in their shadow world. Through it all, Eleanor remained remarkably composed. She asked intelligent questions, observed everything with sharp attention, and never once flinched away from the darker aspects of vampire society. If anything, she seemed to understand it better than Damien had expected. "It's not so different from human politics," she observed one evening, after they had attended a particularly contentious vampire council meeting. "The same power games, the same alliances and betrayals." just with higher stakes and more dramatic consequences. Does it horrify you? Damien asked. Some of it, Eleanor admitted honestly. But not all of it. You've built something here, Damien. A society with rules and structure that protects both vampires and humans from chaos. It's not pretty, but it works. They were sitting in his private study, sharing a bottle of wine that Eleanor could actually drink while Damien pretended to enjoy. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first of the winter season. The question is, Eleanor continued, could I be part of it? Not just as your companion, but as someone who actually contributes something valuable to what you've built. You're thinking about the transformation. I'm thinking about the future. Both possible futures. The one where I die in a few months and leave you to mourn me forever, and the one where I become something else entirely and might not be the person you fell in love with anymore. Damien set down his wineglass and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his cold ones. Eleanor, I need you to know something. Whatever you decide, I will respect it completely. If you choose to remain human and live out your natural lifespan, I will cherish every moment we have together. If you choose the transformation, I will do everything in my power to help you through it successfully, but you don't have to choose right now. Don't I? Eleanor's voice was soft but sad. Damien, I had another appointment with my oncologist yesterday. His breath caught in his throat. And? The tumor is growing faster than they expected. 6 months was optimistic. I might have 6 weeks. The words hit him like a physical blow. 6 weeks. After 3 centuries of existence, 6 weeks felt like the blink of an eye. Then we need to make the most of the time we have, he said, though his voice sounded strained even to his own ears. Eleanor smiled, but there was something in her expression that made his ancient heart skip with worry.
Yes, she said quietly.
We do. Neither of them mentioned that 6 weeks might not be enough time for her to fully recover from the transformation process, even if she chose it immediately. Neither of them mentioned that if she waited much longer, she might be too weak for the process to work at all. But both of them were thinking it. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in white, Damien held Eleanor close and tried not to think about how quickly time was running out. For the first time in his long existence, he understood why mortals feared death so much. It wasn't the dying that was terrifying. It was the leaving behind of everything that made existence worthwhile. Eleanor's condition deteriorated with frightening speed over the next 3 weeks. The vibrant woman who had fearlessly entered Damien's supernatural world became increasingly fragile, though she fought to maintain her independence and dignity with every passing day. Damien found himself spending entire nights simply watching her sleep, memorizing every detail of her face while she was peaceful and pain-free. The medications made her drowsy during the day, but the evenings were still theirs. They would sit together in her living room or his study, talking about everything and nothing, while the unspoken deadline drew closer. Eleanor had stopped working at the Foundation, finally accepting that she no longer had the strength to manage her duties there. Instead, she spent her time putting her affairs in order and, increasingly, asking Damien detailed questions about the vampire transformation process. What does it feel like? She asked one evening as they sat by the fireplace in his study. Snow continued to fall outside, and the city looked like a fairy tale kingdom from the tall windows of his estate. The transformation? Damien considered the question carefully. It's different for everyone. For me, it was like drowning and being reborn at the same time. 3 days of pain so intense that I lost consciousness several times, followed by waking up into a world where every sense was heightened beyond human comprehension.
But you remember being human?
Your memory stayed intact? Yes. Though they feel different now, like looking at photographs of someone else's life. The emotional connections are still there, but muted somehow. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. She had grown thinner in recent weeks, her cheekbones more prominent, her eyes larger in her face, but her mind remained sharp, and her questions about vampire existence had become increasingly specific and practical. What about the bloodlust? How do you control it? Training and discipline, Damien replied. Like any powerful instinct, it can be managed but never eliminated entirely. The first few years are the most difficult. Have you ever lost control? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Damien had been dreading this conversation, knowing that complete honesty might change everything between them. Yes, he said finally. Twice. Once in the early years when I was still learning, and once about 50 years ago when I was betrayed by someone I trusted. Both times, innocent people died. Eleanor absorbed this information without flinching. Do you regret it?
Every day. But you've learned from it. I've tried to.
She reached for his hand, her fingers warm and increasingly fragile against his marble skin. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? Try to learn from our mistakes and do better next time. Their conversations often took these philosophical turns now, as if Eleanor was trying to understand not just the practical aspects of vampire existence, but its moral and emotional complexities as well. She seemed to be weighing something in her mind, though she never explicitly stated what decision she was approaching. Marcus visited Damien's estate more frequently now, ostensibly to discuss vampire business, but actually to check on his king's emotional state. He found Damien one evening standing in the hidden gallery, staring at the Van Gogh that he had described to Eleanor on their first tour. "She's dying," Marcus said without preamble. "I can smell it on you every time you come back from seeing her." "I know," Damien replied, not turning away from the painting. "Are you going to turn her? That's her choice to make, not mine." Marcus moved to stand beside his old friend, following his gaze to the swirling colors and passionate brushstrokes of the masterpiece. "And if she chooses death, then I'll respect her choice. And then what? You'll mourn her for a few decades and eventually move on?" Damien finally turned to look at Marcus, and his lieutenant was startled by the pain he saw in the ancient vampire's eyes. "I don't think I will move on from this one. Damien, she's changed something in me, Marcus. Something I thought was dead permanently. I don't know what I'll be without her, but I don't think it will be the same person who has been leading our kind for the past century." Marcus felt a chill of foreboding. "You're talking about stepping down. I'm talking about the possibility that I might not be capable of leading effectively after she's gone. Whether I step down or simply fail at the job, the result would be the same for our people." Before Marcus could respond, Damien's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, and his expression changed instantly to one of sharp concern. "It's Eleanor," he said, already moving toward the exit. Something's wrong. 20 minutes later, Damien found Eleanor collapsed on the floor of her townhouse bathroom, conscious but unable to get to her feet. Her housekeeper had gone home for the evening, and she had been alone when the dizzy spell hit her. "I'm fine," she insisted as he helped her to her bed, though they both knew it was a lie. "Just got lightheaded for a moment." Damien could hear the irregularity in her heartbeat, could smell the chemical changes in her blood that indicated her body was beginning to shut down. If she was going to make the choice to transform, it would have to be soon. "Eleanor," he said gently, sitting on the edge of her bed and taking her hand. "We need to talk about timing." She met his eyes with the direct gaze he had grown to love. "How much longer do I have? Days, not weeks." Eleanor closed her eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When she opened them again, there was a resolution there that made Damien's chest tighten with both hope and terror. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. "And? I want to try. I want to become what you are." Relief flooded through Damien so powerfully that he had to close his own eyes for a moment to regain his composure. "Are you sure?" "No," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "But I'm sure that I'm not ready to leave you yet. I'm sure that I want to see what we could build together if we had more time. I'm sure that the possibility of centuries with you is worth the risk of losing myself in the transformation." Damien leaned down to press his forehead against hers. "When?" "Tonight, now. If we wait any longer, I might not be strong enough to survive the process." The transformation ritual was more complex than most humans imagined. It wasn't simply a matter of drinking vampire blood or being bitten. The process required specific preparations, the right environment, and most critically, the complete commitment of both parties involved. Damien carried Eleanor to his estate, where Marcus and 2 other trusted vampires had already prepared the ritual chamber. The room was deep beneath the house, carved from solid stone, and warded with protections that had been in place for centuries. It was where Damien himself had been transformed 300 years ago. Eleanor looked remarkably calm as Damien explained the process one final time. She would drink his blood while he drained hers, a delicate balance that would trigger the supernatural change in her cellular structure. Then would come 3 days of death-like sleep while her body died and was reborn as something immortal. "What if I don't wake up?" she asked as she settled onto the stone altar at the center of the room. "Then I'll join you in whatever comes after," Damien replied with absolute sincerity. Eleanor smiled. "That's not an answer that will comfort your people. My people will survive. They always have." The ritual itself was both beautiful and terrible. Eleanor's blood was warm and rich with life, but also tainted with the darkness of her illness. As Damien drank from her throat, he felt her mortality flowing into him. while his ancient power flowed into her through the blood she took from his wrist. For a few moments, they existed in perfect balance, sharing not just blood but memories, emotions, and the essence of what made them who they were. Damien saw flashes of Eleanor's childhood, her relationship with her father, the moment she had received her diagnosis. Eleanor experienced fragments of his centuries-long existence, the loneliness and power and endless complexity of immortal life. Then her heart stopped, and she went limp in his arms. The next 3 days were the longest of Damien's existence. Eleanor lay on the altar like a beautiful corpse, her skin growing pale and cold while her body underwent the fundamental changes that would remake her into a creature of the night. Damien never left her side, monitoring every subtle alteration in her scent, her temperature, the barely detectable energy patterns that indicated the transformation was progressing normally. Marcus tried to convince him to attend to vampire business, but Damien refused to leave the chamber. If Eleanor was going to wake up as a vampire, she would see his face first. If she wasn't going to wake up at all, he wanted to be there for her final moment. On the third evening, just as the sun set beyond the horizon, Eleanor's eyes opened. They were no longer the warm blue of her human existence, but a brilliant silver that seemed to capture and reflect light in impossible ways. She sat up slowly, moving with the fluid grace that all vampires possessed, and looked around the chamber with new senses that could perceive far more than human eyes ever could. "Damien?" Her voice was the same, but there was something different in its quality, a subtle resonance that spoke of supernatural power. "I'm here," he said, though he remained cautiously still. The first few moments after transformation were critical. Some new vampires woke up disoriented and dangerous, with no memory of their human lives or the people they had loved. Eleanor turned to look at him, and when their eyes met, Damien felt a flood of relief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. The intelligence was still there, the wit and warmth and fierce determination that had made him fall in love with her. She was changed, but she was still Eleanor. "How do you feel?" he asked. Eleanor considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her transformed body and heightened senses. "Different. Everything is so much more intense. I can hear your heartbeat, smell the emotions of the vampires upstairs, feel the earth itself beneath this chamber." She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers and marveling at the strength she could sense flowing through them. "But I'm still me. I remember everything. I remember choosing this. The bloodlust? It's there," Eleanor acknowledged. "Like hunger, but deeper, more primal. But it's manageable, for now." Damien finally allowed himself to move closer, reaching out to touch her face with careful reverence. Her skin was marble perfect now, cool and smooth as his own. "Eleanor, I love you too," she said, understanding what he couldn't quite put into words. "Whatever I am now, that hasn't changed." Over the following weeks, Eleanor adapted to her vampire existence with remarkable speed. The enhanced senses that overwhelmed some new vampires seemed to delight her. She spent hours in Damien's hidden gallery, seeing the artwork with new eyes that could perceive layers of color and detail invisible to mortals. She learned to control her supernatural strength and speed, to move through shadows like liquid darkness, to hear conversations from blocks away. But it was her adaptation to vampire society that surprised everyone, including Damien. Eleanor approached the complex politics and ancient hierarchies of his world with the same intelligence and determination she had brought to running her father's foundation. Within a month, she had not only learned the names and allegiances of every major vampire in the city, but had begun suggesting policy changes that would benefit both their kind and the human population they lived among. "She's good at this," Marcus admitted to Damien one evening, after Eleanor had successfully mediated a dispute between two vampire factions that had been feuding for decades. "Better than good. She has instincts for leadership that most of us take centuries to develop." "She was born to it," Damien replied, watching Eleanor move through the vampire court with natural authority. She just needed the right circumstances to let it flourish. What surprised Damien most was how their relationship had evolved since the transformation. He had feared that becoming a vampire would change the essential dynamic between them, would make Eleanor either too different from her human self or too similar to every other immortal he had known. Instead, she seemed to have become more herself than ever before. The illness that had been slowly killing her was gone, replaced by supernatural vitality that made her eyes brighter and her smile more radiant. The clock that had been ticking down her mortal existence had been replaced by the promise of eternity together. But most importantly, the fearlessness that had first attracted him to her had been amplified rather than diminished by her transformation. "I have a proposal," Eleanor said one evening as they stood together on the balcony of his estate, looking out over the city lights. What kind of proposal? A practical one. You've been the vampire king for over a century, carrying the weight of leadership alone. But ruling is easier with a partner, someone who can share the responsibilities and offer different perspectives on complex problems.
Damien turned to look at her, intrigued by the direction of her thoughts.
You're suggesting a co-regency? I'm suggesting that your people might benefit from having both a king and a queen.
Someone who understands the human world as well as you understand the vampire one. Someone who can help bridge the gap between what we were and what we've become. The idea had merit, and they both knew it. Eleanor had already proven her capability in vampire politics, and her recent human experience gave her insights that could be valuable in navigating the modern world. But more than that, Damien realized that the prospect of sharing his throne with her felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in decades. The other vampires would need to accept you, he said carefully. A newly transformed vampire becoming queen immediately would be unprecedented. Eleanor smiled, and there was something in her expression that reminded him of the woman who had fearlessly entered his supernatural world when she was still dying. Then I suppose I'll have to prove that I'm worth accepting. As winter began to give way to spring, Eleanor launched what could only be described as a campaign to win the support of the vampire community. She met with faction leaders, mediated disputes, and proposed reforms that would strengthen their society while protecting their secrets from the human world. She was charming when charm was called for, ruthless when ruthlessness was necessary, and diplomatic when delicate negotiations were required. Most importantly, she never tried to be anything other than exactly who she was. She didn't attempt to imitate Damien's style of leadership or pretend to have experience she lacked. Instead, she offered her own strengths as complementary to his, creating a partnership that was more effective than either of them could have been alone. The formal ceremony to crown her as Vampire Queen took place on the anniversary of her transformation. The ritual was held in the Great Hall of Damien's estate, with representatives from vampire courts around the world in attendance. Eleanor wore a dress of deep crimson that made her silver eyes shine like stars, and when Damien placed the ancient crown on her head, the assembled vampires roared their approval. "Your Majesty," Marcus said afterward, offering Eleanor a formal bow that was both respectful and genuinely warm. "I believe this partnership will serve our people well." Eleanor smiled, her hand finding Damien's as they stood together before their subjects. "I hope so. We have eternity to find out." As the celebration continued around them, Damien reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago he had been alone, powerful but isolated, ruling through fear and ancient authority. Now he stood beside a woman who had chosen to die and be reborn, rather than leave him alone again, who had not only survived the transformation, but had thrived in ways that exceeded his wildest hopes. But perhaps most remarkably of all, Eleanor had kept her promise from their first night together. She had remained exactly who she was, fearless and determined, and unafraid to see through pretense to the truth underneath. She had simply become the immortal version of that same extraordinary woman. "No regrets?" Damien asked quietly as they watched their people celebrate. Eleanor turned to look at him, her silver eyes bright with love and anticipation for all the centuries that stretched ahead of them. "Only one," she said. "What's that?" Her smile was radiant as she replied, "that it took a terminal diagnosis to bring us together. Imagine what we could have accomplished if we'd found each other sooner." Damien laughed, pulling her closer as the celebration swirled around them. "We have forever to find out." And for the first time in 3 centuries, the word forever didn't feel like a burden to him. It felt like a promise. 5 years had passed since Eleanor's transformation, and the vampire world had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Under the joint rule of King Damien and Queen Eleanor, their kind had evolved from a collection of loosely allied factions into a sophisticated society with clear laws, established territories, and most remarkably, a peaceful coexistence with the human world that went far deeper than simple secrecy. Eleanor had proven to be not just a capable ruler, but a visionary one. While Damien maintained his focus on traditional vampire concerns like territory disputes and ancient vendettas, Eleanor had turned her attention to problems that previous vampire leaders had never even considered. She had established programs to help newly transformed vampires adjust to their immortal existence. She had created a network of vampire-owned businesses that provided both employment for their kind and legitimate sources of income that didn't rely on predation or manipulation. Most controversially, she had begun carefully recruiting certain humans into their confidence, building a small but growing network of mortal allies who knew the truth about vampire existence and helped maintain the delicate balance between the two worlds. The humans are getting suspicious, Marcus reported during one of their regular council meetings. Not about us specifically, but about the patterns. Crime rates in vampire territories have dropped dramatically. Missing persons cases have all but disappeared. Some government agencies are starting to notice that certain areas of the city have become remarkably peaceful. Eleanor leaned back in her chair at the head of the council table, her silver eyes thoughtful. Is that necessarily a problem? If we're managing our territory so well that human crime drops, shouldn't that be considered a success? It draws attention, countered Vivian, one of the older vampire nobles who had initially resisted Eleanor's elevation to queen. Our survival has always depended on remaining invisible. Our survival has always depended on adaptation, Eleanor replied calmly. The world is changing. Technology makes it harder to hide every year. Forensic science makes it difficult to feed without leaving evidence. Social media makes it nearly impossible to maintain false identities for centuries at a time. We can either evolve with the times or eventually be exposed by them. Damien watched the exchange with the pride he always felt when Eleanor demonstrated the political acumen that had made her so effective as a leader. She had a way of presenting radical ideas as logical evolution, making even the most conservative vampires consider possibilities they would have rejected outright from anyone else. What exactly are you proposing? Asked Henrik, the vampire who controlled the Northern Territories. Eleanor stood and moved to the large map that dominated one wall of the council chamber. Red pins marked vampire-controlled areas, while blue pins indicated territories where they maintained influence but not direct control. I'm proposing that we stop thinking of humans as either prey or threats and start thinking of them as potential partners. Not all of them, obviously, but carefully selected individuals who could benefit from knowing the truth and who could benefit us in return. She pointed to several areas of the map where crime statistics had improved most dramatically. We already have informal partnerships with certain police officials, prosecutors, and judges. They don't know exactly what we are, but they know that we're effective at maintaining order. What if we formalized those relationships? You're talking about revealing ourselves, Vivian said, her voice sharp with alarm. I'm talking about selective revelation to carefully vetted individuals who would have both the power to help us and compelling reasons to keep our secrets. Eleanor returned to her seat, her expression serious but confident. The old ways served us well for centuries, but they're becoming less viable every year. We can either control how our existence is revealed or wait for someone else to expose us. The debate continued for hours, with various council members arguing the merits and dangers of Eleanor's proposal. Through it all, Damien remained largely silent, partly because he wanted to see how the discussion played out naturally, and partly because he had learned that his immediate support of Eleanor's ideas sometimes made other vampires more resistant to them. Finally, as the night began to give way to dawn, Eleanor called for a formal vote on whether to begin a small pilot program of selective human recruitment. The measure passed by a narrow margin, with several vampires abstaining rather than taking a firm position. We'll start with 5 individuals, Eleanor announced as the council prepared to disperse. Humans who already suspect something unusual about our community and who have both the influence and the discretion to be valuable allies. As the other vampires filed out of the chamber, Damien remained behind with Eleanor and Marcus. The 3 of them had become the informal core of vampire leadership, with Marcus serving as both advisor and liaison between the royal couple and the broader vampire community. That was risky, Marcus observed once they were alone. You're moving faster than many of them are comfortable with. The risk is in moving too slowly, Eleanor replied. Damien, what do you think? Damien considered his words carefully. As king, his opinion carried enormous weight, and he had learned that Eleanor valued his honest assessment even when it meant disagreement. I think you're right about the direction we need to move, he said finally. But I also think Marcus is right about the pace. Some of the older vampires are already struggling to adapt to the changes we've implemented. Pushing too hard, too fast could create a backlash. Eleanor nodded, accepting the criticism with the grace that had made her so effective as a leader. Point taken. We'll proceed carefully with the human recruitment program. But Damien, we can't let fear of change prevent us from evolving. The world won't wait for us to be ready. Later, as they returned to their private quarters in the estate, Damien found himself reflecting on how much their relationship had changed since Eleanor's transformation. In many ways, they had grown closer, their partnership extending beyond the personal into the professional realm in ways that strengthened both aspects of their connection. But there were also new tensions that hadn't existed when Eleanor was mortal. As queen, she had her own political relationships, her own vision for their people's future. her own responsibilities that sometimes conflicted with his priorities as king. They had learned to navigate these challenges, but it required constant communication and compromise in ways that their early relationship hadn't demanded.
Do you ever miss it?
Damien asked as they stood together on their bedroom balcony, watching the sun rise over the city they ruled from the shadows. Miss what? Being mortal.
Having the simplicity of a limited lifespan, of not having to think about consequences that will last for centuries. Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked her about her transformation experience. Sometimes, she admitted, there was something liberating about knowing that my time was limited. It made every decision feel less weighty, in a way. She moved closer to him, her cool skin brushing against his as they stood side by side. But I don't regret the choice. Not for a moment. What we've built together, what we're still building, it's worth the complexity. Even when we disag.